In 1995, 9-year-old Emma Collins disappeared from her family's isolated farmhouse in rural Iowa, while her twin brother slept just feet away in the same bedroom. Despite extensive searches, no trace of Emma was ever found. No footprints in the frost-covered fields, no signs of forced entry, nothing. For 30 years, her family lived with unanswered questions and unbearable silence. But in January 2025, when renovation crews began tearing apart the old Collins farmhouse, they discovered something hidden beneath the floorboards of the twins' bedroom. A discovery that would unravel 3 decades of lies and reveal that the most dangerous secrets are the ones buried closest to home. The Collins farmhouse had always made a particular sound in the mornings, a low, settling groan that moved through the walls like the house itself was waking up, stretching its old bones against the Iowa cold. Luca Collins had grown up with that sound, had slept through it 10,000 times as a boy, and now, standing in the gravel driveway at 7:30 on a gray November morning, he heard it again, through the cracked kitchen window, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He hadn't been back to Harlan County in 11 years. The drive from Des Moines had taken just under 3 hours, and he'd spent most of it watching the landscape flatten and empty around him, until there was nothing left but dead fields and the occasional grain silo rising out of the fog like a monument to something forgotten. Iowa in November had that quality, he always thought. It didn't feel abandoned so much as deliberately emptied, as if the land had decided to hold its breath and wait. The farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the porch railing his father had repaired every spring for 20 years had finally given up entirely, listing sideways against the steps. The big oak tree at the edge of the yard had lost a major limb sometime in the last decade, and the wound in its trunk had gone dark and hollow, a mouth that had nothing left to say. Luca's aunt, Patricia Collins, had called him 6 days ago. She was his father's older sister, in her late 70s now, still living 20 minutes outside of Millhaven, in the same house she'd occupied for 50 years. Her voice on the phone had been careful in a way he recognized, the particular tone people use when they're about to say something that can't be unsaid. The county put the old place up for demolition, she'd told him. Some developer bought the land. They started clearing it last Tuesday. Luca had already known this. He'd received the certified letter months ago, had signed the papers releasing any claim on the property without feeling much of anything. The farm had stopped being home a long time before that. The crew found something, Patricia said. Under the floor in the back bedroom, the one where you and Emma slept. He had not spoken immediately. Outside his apartment window, Des Moines had been going about its Wednesday morning, indifferent. Luca, they found her things. Emma's things. Now he stood in the driveway, looking at the house, and trying to remember the last time he had felt genuinely afraid. Not the low-grade anxiety that had followed him through his adult life, like a second shadow. Not the vague dread that woke him at 3 a.m. with no specific object to attach itself to, but real fear. The kind that comes when something you have arranged your entire existence around suddenly reveals itself to be wrong. The demolition crew had stopped work pending an investigation. Sheriff's tape marked the perimeter of the porch. 2 vehicles sat near the side of the house, one belonging to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, and one a white van he associated with crime scene work. The fields beyond the house ran flat and brown to the tree line, and the fog sat low over everything, softening the edges of things, making the world look like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. Luca had been 8 years old when his sister Emma disappeared. She had been his twin, and people who have never had a twin cannot fully understand what the loss of one means. It is not like losing a sibling. It is like losing the half of yourself that knew, without being told, exactly who you were. For 30 years, he had carried Emma's absence the way you carry a limp, something that alters your gait so gradually that eventually you cannot remember how you used to walk. The farmhouse groaned again in the morning cold, and a curtain shifted in the upstairs window of the back bedroom, moved by a draft from the broken glass. Luca watched it settle and told himself it was only the wind. He was still telling himself that when Sheriff Karen Delaney came around the side of the house and saw him standing in the driveway, and her expression did something complicated that he could not quite read. "Mr. Collins," she said, walking toward him with her hands in her jacket pockets. "I'm glad you came. There are some things you need to see." She said it in the same careful tone his aunt had used, and Luca understood then that whatever had been found under that floor was not going to make anything simpler. He followed her toward the house, and the gravel crunched under his boots, and from somewhere in the fog beyond the tree line, a crow called once and went silent. The back bedroom was at the end of a short hallway on the ground floor, positioned so that its single window looked out over the back field toward the woods. Luca had spent the first 8 years of his life sleeping in that room. He knew every sound it made, knew the particular way the afternoon light moved across the ceiling in summer, knew that the third floorboard from the door had a soft spot that his mother had always meant to have fixed. He had not been inside it since the week after Emma disappeared, when a county investigator had taken his statement at the kitchen table and his parents had quietly closed the bedroom door and never fully opened it again. The room looked gutted now. The demolition crew had pulled up a section of flooring near the east wall, exposing the framework beneath, and portable work lights had been set up around the opening. Crime scene technician Mark Olson was kneeling beside it when Luca and Sheriff Delaney entered, and he stood and nodded without offering his hand, which Luca appreciated. He was not sure he could have managed a handshake. "The space runs approximately 4 feet along the east wall," Olson said, his voice the flattened professional tone of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. "It's not structural. It was constructed deliberately after the original build. The access panel was cut from the existing flooring and relaid so it sat flush. Unless you knew where to look, you would never find it." Luca looked at the opening in the floor. The space below was dark and narrow. The smell that rose from it was damp and enclosed, like earth that had been sealed away from air for a very long time. "What did you find in there?" he asked. Olson lifted a clear evidence bag from beside the opening. Inside was a small backpack, purple and faded, with a cartoon sun printed on the front. Luca had seen that backpack on his sister's shoulders so many times that the sight of it behind plastic felt obscene, wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. "We'll need a formal identification," Olson said gently. "But given the description in the original report—" "It's hers," Luca said. There were other items. A pair of small shoes, white canvas, with grass stains on the toes. A folded sweater in yellow cotton that Luca remembered Emma wearing on the last photograph ever taken of her. A school picture from September 1994. A plastic flashlight, the kind sold for $1 at hardware stores, its batteries long dead. And a notebook. Sheriff Delaney showed him the notebook last, held in its evidence bag so he could read the cover without touching it. It was a standard composition book, its cover decorated with stickers of flowers and small animals, the way a child decorates things when they believe the world is essentially friendly. Emma had always covered her notebooks in stickers. "The entries begin about 6 weeks before she disappeared," Delaney said. "We'd like you to read them at the station, under controlled conditions. But I'm going to tell you now that what's in there changes the picture significantly." "Changes it how?" Delaney looked at Olson. Then she looked at Luca with the expression of someone about to break something that cannot be repaired. "The entries suggest that Emma knew the person who was coming into this room, that she had been placed in that crawl space multiple times before the night she vanished, and that she believed she was protecting someone by staying quiet. Luca stood in the room where he had slept beside his sister for 8 years and felt the floor shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the damage the demolition crew had caused. He looked at the hole in the floorboards, at the darkness below, and thought about what it meant that Emma had been hidden there, in the dark, within feet of where he had been sleeping. "She was down there," he said, "while I was in this room." Possibly on more than one occasion, yes. Luca said nothing else for a long time. The work lights hummed. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the backfield was no longer visible through the window. He noticed that the soft spot in the third floorboard from the door was still there, and something about that small continuity, something so ordinary surviving intact while everything else had been revealed as false, made it briefly very hard to breathe. The conference room at the Harlan County Sheriff's Department was a rectangular space with fluorescent lighting and a table that had been there long enough to carry decades of coffee rings. Luca sat at one end of it, with latex gloves on his hands, and Emma's notebook open in front of him. And he read his dead sister's words for the first time in a room that smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee, while rain began to tap against the single high window. She had been a careful writer for a child of 8. Her letters were round and deliberate, each word given its own space on the line, as if she understood that what she was recording was important and deserved to be legible. October 2nd, 1994. He came again last night. He said I have to be very quiet and go to the special place under the floor and wait until he tells me it is okay to come out. He said Luca cannot know because Luca would not understand, and if Luca finds out, then the bad thing will happen to our family. He brought me a juice box and crackers. He said I am being so good. I do not feel good. The special place is very dark, and I can hear Luca breathing through the floor, and I want to wake him up, but I am too scared. Luca set the notebook down and stared at the opposite wall for a moment. Then he picked it up and continued. October 9th, 1994. He told me the special place is to keep me safe from people who want to hurt our family. He said there are people watching our house, and if they see me, they will know I am special, and they will come for Luca too. I asked him why they want to hurt us. He said some children are chosen, and we do not get to decide. He touched my hair and said I was the bravest girl he knew. I do not like when he touches my hair. October 17th, 1994. I saw the way he looked at Mr. Harper when Mr. Harper came to the house for supper. Mr. Harper is the deputy. He and Dad talked for a long time outside. When they came back in, Mr. Harper looked at me and smiled, but it was not a nice smile. I think Mr. Harper knows about the special place. I think maybe he is part of it. Luca read that entry twice. Then he stood up and walked to the door and knocked once. Sheriff Delaney appeared almost immediately, which told him she had been waiting outside. Daniel Harper, Luca said. Was he involved in the original investigation? Delaney's expression answered before she did. He was one of the lead investigators. He left the department in 1997. Retired early, people said. He's still in the county. Emma writes about him. She saw him. She thought he was part of whatever was happening to her. Delaney stepped into the room and closed the door. I know. We've read the entries. We're being careful about how we proceed because Harper has connections in this county that go back 40 years, and we can't afford to move on him before we have something solid. He was in my parents' house, Luca said. "He sat at our table. I remember him. He used to bring my dad fishing lures." "I know." Luca sat back down and read the rest of the notebook. The entries grew shorter as October became November, as if Emma had grown tired, or frightened, or both. The handwriting changed, too, becoming less careful, the letters slightly compressed, as if she were writing faster, or with less light. The second-to-last entry read, November 11th, 1994. He says, "Soon I will have to go to the real safe place, which is not under the floor, but somewhere farther away." He showed me a picture of a building in the woods. He said, "It is very quiet there, and no one will bother me." He said, "Luca will be safe as long as I go without telling." I am going to write Luca a letter. I am going to tell him everything. But I am scared if I write down the name, the bad thing will happen, so I will just say, "He is." The final entry was a single line, dated November 14th, 4 days before Emma was reported missing. It said only, "I am trying to remember that I love him, but tonight I cannot." Luca sat with that sentence for a long time. The rain against the window had grown heavier. He was not crying, which surprised him. He felt instead like something very cold had moved into his chest and taken up permanent residence, something that had always been there, but had previously been too small to notice. He had always known, somewhere below the reach of language, that Emma's disappearance had not been random. He had built his adult life, his caution, his difficulty with closeness and trust, on the unexamined belief that evil came without warning and from outside. He was beginning to understand that what he had actually known at 8 years old was something closer to the truth, and that his mind had done with that knowledge exactly what Emma's had done with it. It had hidden it somewhere dark and narrow, and waited. Daniel Harper lived in a house at the end of a gravel road 9 miles outside of Millhaven, surrounded by the kind of mature oak trees that take 70 years to grow and suggest a family that has been in a place a very long time. The house was well maintained in the way of a man who has always cared about appearances. White siding freshly painted, gutters clear, a flag on the porch that moved slowly in the November wind. Luca was not supposed to be there. Sheriff Delaney had been explicit about that. She had told him to stay at the motel, to let the department handle the approach to Harper, to trust the process. He had agreed, and meant it at the time. But at 2 a.m, lying on the thin mattress of the Millhaven Motor Inn, listening to the silence of a small Iowa town at rest, he had understood that he was not capable of trusting a process that had already failed his sister once. He parked on the road and walked up the gravel drive on foot. The fog was heavier here, settled between the oaks like something that had come to stay. The house was dark, except for a single lamp in a ground-floor window, and through the glass, Luca could see a man in a recliner, reading. He was in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with white hair and the careful posture of someone accustomed to being seen as a figure of authority. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like the kind of man you trusted without deciding to. Luca stood in the dark outside that window for a long moment. He thought about Emma hiding in the dark beneath the floor. He thought about the sentence, "He brought me a juice box and crackers." He thought about a deputy sheriff sitting at his family's kitchen table and smiling at an 8-year-old girl with a smile that was not a nice smile. Then his phone rang, very loud in the quiet, and the man inside looked up at the window. Luca answered as he walked back to his car. It was Delaney, her voice tight. "We found a storage unit registered under Harper's name in a commercial facility outside of Cedar Falls. The manager called it in when he saw the news coverage about the farmhouse. He says Harper has rented it continuously since 1996. What's in it? We don't have a warrant yet, but the manager says he's seen Harper go in and out over the years. Always alone, always at irregular hours. He described Harper as the kind of man who made him feel like he should look away. Luca drove back toward Millhaven on empty roads, with the fog pressing against the windshield. He kept thinking about the original investigation, about the way Harper would have had access to everything. The crime scene, the witness statements, the physical evidence, the decisions about which leads to pursue and which to let go cold. A man in that position could shape an investigation the way a river shapes a valley, so gradually that no single change looks like sabotage. He had been one of the first responders when Luca's mother had called in Emma's disappearance. Luca remembered him standing in the kitchen that morning, a big, reassuring presence, telling his parents that they would find her. Remembered the particular quality of certainty in his voice. Not the certainty of hope, Luca understood now, but the certainty of knowledge. He pulled over on the empty road and sat with the engine running. In the rearview mirror, the road behind him disappeared into the fog within 20 yards, and there was nothing visible in any direction except the pale gravel and the dark shapes of fields on either side. Iowa in November at 3 in the morning felt like the edge of the known world. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. A single photograph. It showed Luca's car, parked on Harper's Road, taken from above and behind. Below the image were 4 words. "You should go home." Luca looked at his phone for a long time. Then he forwarded the message and image to Delaney and drove back to the motel. He did not sleep. The forensic psychologist that Sheriff Delaney brought in from Iowa City was named Dr. Anita Reyes, and she had the kind of patient stillness that Luca associated with people who have spent years listening to things most people would prefer not to hear. She explained the process carefully and without drama, sitting across from him in a quiet room at the county administrative building on a gray Tuesday morning, while the heat ticked in the vents, and the world outside the single window showed nothing but a parking lot and the backs of bare oak branches. She told him what he already knew professionally, that traumatic memories in children are frequently stored in fragmented, inaccessible ways. That the mind of a child witnessing something it cannot process will sometimes partition the experience entirely, filing it somewhere below the reach of ordinary recollection. That this is not a failure of character or an act of cowardice, but a function of a nervous system protecting itself from unbearable information. Luca told her he understood. He told her he was ready. He was not ready. But he was 38 years old, and he had spent 30 years not being ready, and the evidence of what that had cost was sitting in a sealed evidence bag in a county facility 12 minutes away. Dr. Reyes guided him down through the standard progressive relaxation techniques, and after a period of time that he could not accurately measure, the room around him became less present, and the past became less inaccessible, and he was 8 years old, and the farmhouse was making its nighttime sounds around him. He could hear Emma in her bed across the room. She was already asleep, her breathing slow and even. They had been up late playing cards with their mother, and Luca's eyes had been heavy since before 9, and now the room was dark, and the fields outside were still, and everything was as it always was. He heard footsteps in the hall, not his parents' footsteps, which he knew as well as his own heartbeat. These were slower, more deliberate, carrying a weight and a quality of intent that his child's mind had received and immediately translated into something other than what it was. A neighbor, he had told himself. A relative. Someone with a reason to be there. The door opened 3 inches. The smell that came through was familiar in a way that did not belong to his immediate family. A particular combination of aftershave and wool, and something else he could not name then, and could not name now, but knew. He had known it his entire life. He had known it every time a certain truck came up the driveway. Every time a certain laugh came from the kitchen table. Not his father, not anyone who lived in that house. A voice, very low. "Come on, Em. Nice and quiet." And Emma's voice, so small he nearly missed it. "Okay." The sound of bare feet on the floor. The particular soft quality of a child trying not to be heard. The door closing. And then silence. And Luca lying in his bed with his eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. Pretending so effectively that within 5 minutes he had convinced not just the man in the hallway, but himself. And by morning the memory had been stored somewhere his waking mind would not go for 30 years. When Dr. Reyes brought him back to the present, Luca was sitting with both hands flat on the table in front of him, and his breathing was very controlled in the way of a person trying to keep something large from escaping. The room was the same. The parking lot was still there beyond the window. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. "The voice," Dr. Reyes said gently. "Can you place it now, with adult understanding?" "Yes," Luca said. "Do you need a moment before you tell me?" "No." He looked at his hands on the table. It was Daniel Harper. Delaney was in the room within 4 minutes. The session had been recorded with his consent and witnessed. By the time Luca had drunk the water someone put in front of him and managed something approximating steadiness, Delaney was on the phone coordinating with the county prosecutor and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. "The storage unit warrant came through an hour ago," she told him. "Teams are there now. Luca, I need you to understand that what they find may be difficult." "Tell me." What they found in the storage unit outside of Cedar Falls was a room within a room. A metal shelving unit on one wall stacked with labeled boxes, and behind it a false partition that opened onto a smaller, sealed space. Inside that space were hard drives, journals, and 15 years of meticulous documentation in Daniel Harper's handwriting. Records of names, dates, locations, a map of Harlan County with properties marked in red, properties that did not belong to Harper officially, purchased through layered arrangements of LLCs and nominal buyers, the same pattern repeated across 20 years. Among the journals was one that began in 1993, the year before Emma disappeared. Harper's handwriting was precise and small. The early entries documented what he described, in language that twisted Luca's stomach with its bureaucratic calm, as placement of chosen children in prepared environments. Emma was not the first, she was the third. And the prepared environment he had arranged for her was a converted root cellar on a 12-acre parcel of land in the wooded northern part of the county, purchased the previous spring. Ground-penetrating radar units were deployed to that property before nightfall. The property in the northern part of Harlan County had no address on any official record, only the parcel number on a deed held by a company that existed only on paper. The access road was 2 tire tracks through a stand of old-growth oak and elm that had been undisturbed long enough to nearly close overhead. And when the convoy of county and state vehicles moved up it in the early morning, with their lights cutting through the fog, the branches scraped the roofs of the cars like hands reaching down. The building at the end of the track was a single-story structure that had once been a hunting cabin, its original purpose visible only in the configuration of the windows and the placement of a rusted hook on the porch beam where something had once been hung. Someone had added to it and enclosed it and made it into something else over the years. The modifications were not visible from outside. They were visible only when you went through the interior floor and found the stairs leading down. Luca was not supposed to be there either. Delaney had been clear. He was a witness and a family member, not an investigator, and the situation was operationally sensitive in ways she did not have time to explain. He had agreed, and this time he had stayed in the car until the tactical team had cleared the structure and the crime scene units had begun their work. And then Delaney had come to the car herself and looked at him for a moment and said simply, quietly, "You should come." The root cellar below the cabin was larger than the structure above it suggested. The ceiling was reinforced concrete, the walls stone, and someone had run electricity down here at some point because there were outlets and a fixture in the ceiling and the remains of a space heater in the corner. The floor was compacted earth. Along the east wall was a narrow cot with a folded blanket on it, and above the cot was a shelf that held books, their spines faded and warped from years of humidity. And beside the shelf were marks carved into the stone wall in groups of 5, hundreds of them, ascending from floor level to just above the height a child's arm could reach, and then stopping, and then beginning again at a different height, a child who had grown. A crime scene technician was photographing the walls. Luca stood in the center of the space and understood, in a complete and physical way that bypassed language entirely, what this room had been for. Emma had been here. The marks on the wall were hers. The books were hers. The folded blanket on the cot was not a detail from a story. It was a thing his sister had touched with her hands. He found the letter in a metal box under the cot, half corroded, but sealed with electrical tape against the damp. The crime scene technician opened it carefully, and inside were 4 sheets of notebook paper in Emma's handwriting, dated November 1994, and a photograph of Luca and Emma at their 8th birthday party, grinning at the camera, with frosting on their faces. The technician read the letter aloud in the flat, recitative tone that professionals use to keep their voices steady. Dear Luca, if you find this, it means I could not come home on my own. I am writing it in case. I need you to know that I am not here because I wanted to be. I am here because he told me if I did not come quietly, something bad would happen to you, and I believed him. I still believe him a little. He is very certain about things. He is someone you know and someone Mom and Dad know. He said the reason he cannot tell anyone is because the world would not understand. He said he is keeping me pure, which is a word I do not completely understand, but it makes me feel very cold when he says it. I have been counting days. There have been a lot of days. I think about twin telepathy, and I try to send you thoughts through the walls. Can you feel them? I hope you can feel them. If I get out of here, I want to tell you everything, but I am going to hide this letter in case I cannot. His name is... The letter ended there. The last sentence had been started and stopped, and the name was not written. Luca stood in the cellar and held the letter in gloved hands and did not say anything for a long time. The ground-penetrating radar teams worked through the afternoon and into the early dark. They found 3 anomalies in the soil of the surrounding woods. 3 sites where the earth had been disturbed and had compressed and settled over decades into the particular configuration that the equipment identified, and that everyone present understood immediately without anyone having to describe it aloud. Emma's remains were identified by dental records 9 days later. She had not died in the cellar. She had been moved. She had been, according to the medical examiner's preliminary assessment, approximately 10 years old at the time of her death, which placed it approximately 2 years after her disappearance. 2 years of counting days on a stone wall in the dark. The other 2 sites yielded remains that would take longer to identify. Girls from the county, from adjacent counties, from case files that investigators were already pulling, cold cases from the 1990s and early 2000s that no one had ever connected to one another, because no one had known to look for the connection. Daniel Harper was apprehended at his home at 6:17 in the morning, 11 days after the farmhouse demolition crew found Emma's backpack under the floor. He came to the door in a flannel robe and looked at the assembled officers and at Delaney and at the warrant in her hand and said nothing. He did not look afraid. He looked, Luca was told by the deputy who described the scene to him later, like a man who had been expecting something to arrive for a very long time and had finally accepted that it had. If this story has stayed with you, if Emma's voice in that notebook and Luca's long walk back to the truth have felt like something worth following, then subscribe to True Stories Vault. Every week, we bring you cases like this one, stories where the darkness is real and the search for answers never quite ends the way you expect. Hit the subscribe button now and leave a comment below telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest. Was it the marks on the wall? The unfinished letter? The name Emma could not bring herself to write? We read every comment, and we want to know what you are carrying with you after this one. But here is the thing that Delaney told Luca 3 weeks later, sitting across from him in the same conference room where he had first read Emma's notebook. And this is the thing that would not leave him. Among the files in the sealed room of Harper's storage unit, there was a document, a birth record. A child born in 1997, 3 years after Emma disappeared, in a small county hospital 60 miles from Millhaven. The birth record listed the mother as a Jane Doe, unidentified, and the child, a girl, had been placed through a private adoption agency that no longer existed. The adoption had been arranged by a man whose signature on the agency documents matched Daniel Harper's handwriting across every characteristic that the document examiner identified. Emma had been 14 when she died, according to the medical examiner. She had been in that cellar for 6 years before she died. And somewhere in Iowa, or in one of the 37 states to which the now dissolved adoption agency had placed children over 12 years of operation, there was a young woman of approximately 28 years old who did not know her own name, did not know her mother's name, did not know that her mother had spent 6 years counting days on a stone wall and trying to send thoughts through concrete and writing letters she could not finish. Delaney slid the document across the table to Luca. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "We're trying to trace the agency's records," she said. "It will take time. The documents are incomplete. But she might be alive. She might be alive." Luca sat in the fluorescent light of the conference room and held that fact in his hands, the way you hold something fragile and unprecedented, something you have no previous experience with and no framework for. A niece who did not know she was a niece. A daughter of his twin sister, which made her something he had no name for, something adjacent to a daughter of his own, something half-made of his blood. Emma had been in that cellar for 6 years, alone, and out of that darkness she had somehow produced a life, and that life had been taken from her and placed somewhere in the country under a name that was not hers, attached to a history that was not hers, belonging, formally and legally, to a version of the world that Harper had arranged. "He knew about the child," Luca said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He arranged the adoption." "Yes." "And he has never said a word." "He has not said anything since his arrest. His attorney is excellent." Luca looked at the birth record. He thought about Emma at 8 years old, covering her notebook in animal stickers because she still believed the world was fundamentally good. He thought about her at 14, which was a thing he could not quite do, which his mind kept stepping around the way you step around something on the floor in the dark. He thought about a woman of 28, somewhere, living a life she had been assigned, and not knowing. and the particular quality of that not knowing, the completeness of it, the way it would mean she was also not grieving, not searching, simply living inside the version of herself that had been arranged for her by a man who was now sitting in a county jail, speaking to no one. "When you find her," Luca said carefully, "how do you tell someone something like that?" Delaney had no answer for that. She said she didn't know. She said they would try to do it carefully, with support, with professionals present. She said all the things you say when you are describing a task for which no adequate preparation exists. Luca drove back toward Des Moines in the late afternoon, and the Iowa landscape flattened around him as it always did, and the sky was the particular gray of November that looks less like weather and more like an absence of light. He drove for an hour before he pulled over on an empty county road and sat with the engine running and his hands on the wheel. Emma had a daughter. That daughter was alive and did not know who she was. And somewhere in the administrative machinery of a system that had already failed his family once, a process was beginning that would eventually deliver to a 28-year-old woman the most complete destruction of her understanding of herself that it is possible to receive. She would learn that her mother had existed and suffered and loved her enough to stay alive through 6 years of darkness. She would also learn that everything she had been told about her origins was a document arranged by the man who had created those 6 years of darkness. She would spend the rest of her life in the space between those two facts, which was not a comfortable space, which was not a space designed for living in, but it was the only space available. It was the truth. Luca sat on the empty road as the last of the afternoon light failed completely, and the fog came up from the fields on either side and closed around the car. And he thought about twin telepathy, about sending thoughts through walls and floors and 30 years of silence, about whether the connection that had existed between him and Emma, the one he had carried like a wound for 3 decades, had also existed between Emma and her daughter, unsuspected, unfelt, a thread of inheritance neither of them had words for. He thought about a young woman in some ordinary place, some ordinary city or town, going about the unremarkable business of a Wednesday evening, without any awareness that in a county sheriff's office in Iowa, a case file with her name on it, a name she did not know was hers, was currently being assembled with care. He thought about the moment when that would change. He did not know if he was hoping for her sake or for his own, when he found himself hoping she was not yet ready for it, that she had a little more time, that the ordinary Wednesday would last a few days longer. Then he put the car in gear and drove home through the dark, and the fog closed behind him on the empty road, and there was nothing left to see.